The operation had no official name, at least none that has been confirmed through any channel that can be cited. What is known, pieced together from multiple sources across several intelligence communities, from intercepts that have been partially described to select journalists, and from the particular silence of governments that would normally have something to say, is that a United States Navy SEAL team conducted a targeted elimination operation inside Iranian territory, and that the individual killed was not a mid-level commander, not a proxy militia leader operating in a third country, not a nuclear scientist whose death could be attributed to the shadow war that Israel and Iran have been fighting for years. The individual killed was Mojtaba Kahmeni, the second son of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had been quietly, carefully, and with increasing institutional momentum, being positioned as the most likely successor to the most powerful position in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The confirmation process for an operation of this nature is never clean and never fast. Governments deny, deflect, and obfuscate as a matter of institutional reflex, and in cases where an operation crosses lines that even allied governments find uncomfortable, the denial is more sustained and more elaborate than usual. What has emerged through the reporting process is a picture that is incomplete in its details, but coherent in its outline. American Special Operations Forces, operating under authorities that have not been publicly disclosed and through an insertion method that remains classified, reached a location inside Iran where Mojtaba Khamenei was present and conducted a strike that killed him. The operation was surgical in the sense that word is used by military planners, meaning that it achieved its objective with precision and without the kind of collateral destruction that would have made deniability impossible, but its strategic consequences are anything but surgical. They are expansive, destabilizing, and almost certainly irreversible in their implications for the trajectory of the current crisis. The decision to conduct this operation did not emerge from nowhere, and understanding it requires understanding the logic chain that led American decision-makers to a choice that, even within the classified deliberations of the National Security Council, must have been recognized as one of the most consequential actions the United States government had taken in the Middle East in years. The logic began with the naval engagement in the Persian Gulf. American forces had been fired upon. American sailors had been wounded. The credibility of American deterrence had been directly challenged in a manner that demanded a response. But the conventional response options, a proportional strike on Iranian naval assets, a degradation of IRGC Navy infrastructure, a show of force through repositioning of carrier strike groups, had all been gamed out by American planners and found wanting in a specific respect. They would impose costs on Iran without changing the fundamental calculation of the Iranian leadership about whether continued escalation served Iranian interests. And the Iranian leadership in the current crisis environment had already demonstrated a willingness to absorb costs that previous Iranian governments might have found prohibitive. The question that American planners found themselves confronting was how to impose a cost that was sufficiently severe to genuinely alter the Iranian leadership's calculus without triggering the full-scale regional war that everyone in Washington understood would be catastrophic. Strikes on nuclear facilities carried the risk of driving Iran to accelerate weaponization rather than abandon its program. Strikes on oil infrastructure would devastate the Iranian economy, but would also send oil prices to levels that would damage the global economy and potentially fracture the international coalition supporting American policy. Strikes on IRGC military bases would kill soldiers and destroy equipment, but would not change the fundamental decision-making of the men at the top of the Iranian system. What would change that decision-making? What would deliver a message that could not be reinterpreted, managed, or absorbed? Was reaching into the succession structure of the Islamic Republic itself and removing the individual who represented the continuity of the system. Mojtaba Khamenei had been a subject of intense intelligence focus for years, long before the current crisis made the question of Iranian succession an immediate strategic concern. His trajectory within the Iranian system had been tracked by American, Israeli, and other Western intelligence agencies with the kind of granular attention that the services devote to individuals who may one day hold decisive power over a country of significant strategic importance. What those agencies had documented was the story of a man who had spent decades building the institutional foundations of a succession that his father had never formally acknowledged, but had never moved to prevent. Mojtaba had cultivated relationships within the IRGC at the most senior levels, relationships that gave him influence over the organization that is simultaneously the Islamic Republic's most powerful military force and its most important political institution. He had developed ties within the clerical establishment, carefully navigating the factional politics of the Hawza, the Shia seminary system, in ways that positioned him as a figure acceptable to a broad enough range of clerical opinion to make his elevation as supreme leader a viable institutional outcome. He had operated largely from the shadows, avoiding the kind of public profile that would have made him a target for the internal political opponents who had reasons to prefer alternative succession scenarios. He had also, according to intelligence assessments that were shared with senior American officials in the weeks before the current crisis, been playing an active role in the decisions that had led to the current escalation. The ballistic missile strike on Tel Aviv, the authorization of the IRGC Navy engagement with American forces. Mojtaba Kahmeni was assessed as having been among the most influential voices within the Iranian leadership, pushing for a more aggressive posture, operating on the calculation that a dramatic demonstration of Iranian power would strengthen his own position in the succession dynamic by associating him with the narrative of Iranian strength and resolve that the hardline establishment finds most compelling. He was, in the intelligence community's assessment, not merely the future of the Islamic Republic, but an active architect of the decisions that had brought the current crisis to its current point. This assessment was what elevated him from a long-term strategic concern to an immediate operational target. The decision to act was made at the highest levels of the American government, with the full awareness of what it meant and what it risked. It was not made lightly, and it was not made quickly. The legal frameworks governing targeted killing operations conducted by American forces outside of formally declared war zones are complex, contested, and in the current case, subject to interpretations that will be debated by lawyers and scholars for years. The operational authorities invoked were drawn from the deepest and broadest interpretations of presidential power in the area of national self-defense, and the specific finding that authorized the operation was reportedly among the most tightly held documents in the American national security system, with a distribution list so limited that even senior officials with direct equities in the outcome were not read in until after the operation had been executed. The SEAL team that conducted the operation had been positioned for contingency operations in the region for weeks, part of the broader buildup of American special operations assets that had accompanied the escalating crisis. The specific preparation for this mission, the intelligence gathering, the target tracking, the insertion planning, the rehearsals, had been conducted under conditions of extraordinary operational security. The team's existence in the region was known to a very small number of people. The specific mission they were preparing for was known to fewer still. The operational security discipline required to keep a mission of this nature hidden in an environment where every American military movement in the Gulf region is being tracked by Iranian intelligence, Russian signals collection, and commercial satellite imagery providers represents one of the most demanding achievements of the American special operations community in years, and the fact that it succeeded, that the mission was executed without being compromised in the preparation phase, is itself a significant indicator of the capabilities that American special operations forces have maintained even through the resource pressures and institutional challenges of recent years. The insertion was conducted at night, using methods consistent with what American special operations doctrine describes as denied area access, the ability to place forces inside territory controlled by a sophisticated adversary without detection. The specific technique employed has not been confirmed through any open source, and this account does not speculate beyond what can be supported. What the sources consulted for this account consistently describe is a mission that proceeded according to plan through the critical phases and achieved its objective. Mojtaba Khamenei was killed. The team extracted. The Iranian government's initial awareness of what had happened took time to develop, and that delay, that window between the execution of the mission and Tehran's full understanding of what had occurred, was itself operationally significant, providing the extraction with a margin of security that might not have existed if Iranian forces had understood immediately what they were dealing with. Tehran's realization of what had happened unfolded in stages that intelligence agencies monitoring Iranian communications were able to track in real time. The first stage was the discovery of the death itself, which triggered a communications pattern within the Iranian leadership that was immediately flagged by signals intelligence assets as inconsistent with normal operational traffic and consistent with a major internal crisis. The second stage was the dawning recognition, pieced together by Iranian intelligence from physical evidence, from whatever surveillance coverage existed at the location, and from the pattern of the operation itself, that this was not a natural death, not an accident, and not an internal Iranian act. The third stage, and the one that produced the most dramatic spike in intercepted communications, was the conclusion that American forces had conducted the operation. That conclusion, when it crystallized within the Iranian leadership, produced a reaction that the intelligence agencies monitoring it described in terms that conveyed genuine shock, not the performed shock of a government preparing a public statement, but the authentic shock of a leadership that had convinced itself that certain lines would not be crossed and had just discovered it was wrong. The news broke publicly through a combination of Iranian state media and leak simultaneously, which itself tells a story. Iranian state media, operating under instructions that clearly had not yet fully processed the event, initially reported a death without specifying cause or location, using language that suggested an accident rather than an assassination. Within the same news cycle, reports from sources outside Iran, from exile media, from journalists in contact with intelligence sources in multiple Western capitals, and from the social media networks that now constitute a parallel information ecosystem operating entirely outside any government's control, were providing far more specific and far more accurate accounts of what had actually happened. The gap between the official Iranian narrative and the emerging factual record closed with a speed that the Islamic Republic's information management apparatus was visibly unable to keep pace with. By the time Iranian state media pivoted to more accurate coverage, the basic facts had already been established in the public record by sources beyond Tehran's ability to influence. Israel's role in the operation, the question of whether the SEAL mission was conducted with Israeli intelligence support, Israeli operational participation, or Israeli political authorization, is one of the most sensitive and consequential dimensions of the story, and also one of the least certain. What can be said is that an operation of this nature, conducted inside Iranian territory, targeting an individual with the profile of Mojtaba Khamenei, would almost certainly have required intelligence inputs that could only have come from sources with deep penetration of the Iranian system. The Mossad, whose track record of operational success inside Iran is more extensively documented than that of any other foreign intelligence service, has historically provided intelligence support for American operations in the region and has its own long history of conducting targeted elimination operations against Iranian individuals. Whether the mission was a joint American-Israeli operation, an American operation conducted with Israeli intelligence support, or an American operation that Israel was informed of but did not participate in directly, is a distinction that both governments have powerful reasons to obscure and that the available public record does not currently resolve. What is not obscure is the Israeli political response to news of the operation. Senior Israeli officials, speaking without attribution to multiple international media outlets in the hours following the public confirmation of Mojtaba Khamenei's death, used language that was unmistakably approving. One official described the development as a significant degradation of Iran's capacity to maintain a coherent, aggressive strategy. Another suggested that the elimination of the succession figure most closely associated with the escalation decisions of the current crisis removed an important driver of Iranian aggression. These comments were not accidental. They were calibrated to express Israeli endorsement of the American action while maintaining a formal posture of neither confirming nor denying any Israeli involvement, a posture that both countries had clear reasons to maintain. The Iranian government's formal response, when it came, was a document that combined fury with the kind of formal diplomatic language that governments use when they want to convey the maximum degree of threat while preserving some degree of future flexibility. Iran held the United States directly responsible for what it described as an act of state terrorism and a flagrant violation of international law. It reserved the right to respond at a time and in a manner of its own choosing. It called on the international community to condemn what it described as an unprecedented attack on the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic and the sanctity of its leadership, and it made specific, if carefully worded, reference to American interests and American personnel in the region as potential targets of the response it was promising. That last element, the explicit reference to American personnel as potential targets, was not rhetorical. It was assessed by American intelligence as a genuine operational threat indicator, and the force protection posture of American military and diplomatic facilities throughout the Middle East was elevated immediately in response. The embassies in Baghdad, Beirut, Amman, and across the Gulf were placed on heightened alert. American military installations in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates implemented emergency force protection measures. The carrier strike groups repositioned again, this time with defensive spacing that reflected the assessment that Iranian retaliatory action could come from multiple directions simultaneously, using a combination of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drone swarms, and proxy forces that the IRGC had spent years positioning and equipping for exactly this kind of distributed retaliation campaign. The succession question inside Iran, the question that the entire operation had been designed to address at the strategic level, was now operating in a fundamentally different environment than it had been 24 hours earlier. Mojtaba Khamenei's elimination did not resolve the succession. It complicated it in ways that could cut in multiple directions. On one hand, it removed the individual who had been most consistently associated with the aggressive escalation strategy, potentially creating space for voices within the Iranian system who favored a different approach. On the other hand, it handed the hardline establishment a martyrdom narrative of extraordinary power. The supreme leader's own son, killed by American forces in an act that the Iranian government would frame as the ultimate expression of American imperialism and hostility toward the Islamic Republic. That narrative, deployed skillfully within Iranian domestic politics, could strengthen the hardliners rather than weaken them, unifying the Iranian population around a government that had just suffered a humiliation of the most personal kind. The Assembly of Experts, the clerical body constitutionally responsible for selecting a new supreme leader, was in an impossible position. Its deliberations are secret by design and tradition, but the crisis environment in which it now found itself was forcing a pace of internal discussion for which neither its procedures nor its recent history had prepared it. The question of succession, which had been a sensitive background concern for years, had been violently thrust to the foreground by a combination of the supreme leader's age and uncertain health, and now the death of the man most widely considered his likely successor. The Assembly's members, senior clerics whose influence within the Iranian system is profound, but whose operational experience of crisis management at this level is limited, were navigating territory for which there was no reliable map. The broader international reaction to news of the operation moved through predictable channels with predictable positions, but with an undercurrent of genuine alarm that distinguished it from the routine condemnations and expressions of concern that characterize normal diplomatic responses to Middle Eastern violence. Russia and China condemned the operation in the strongest terms available to them, calling it a violation of international law, a destabilizing act, and a precedent whose consequences the United States would bear responsibility for. European governments issued more carefully calibrated statements that condemned the violation of Iranian sovereignty while acknowledging the context of Iranian aggression that had preceded it, a formulation that satisfied nobody, but reflected the genuine ambivalence of European governments caught between their alliance with the United States and their deep concern about where the current crisis was heading. Arab governments in the Gulf issued statements through diplomatic channels that were calibrated with exquisite care to avoid taking any position that could be construed as endorsing an operation that had killed a Muslim leader on Muslim soil, while simultaneously conveying through private channels their understanding of the strategic logic that had driven the American decision. The legal and normative dimensions of the operation were being debated in real time by international law scholars, former government officials, and security analysts whose assessments were being published and broadcast as quickly as they could be produced. The targeted killing of a head of state or a head of state's immediate family member by the forces of another country, conducted on the soil of the target country, without any formal declaration of war, under legal authorities that had not been publicly articulated, raised questions that the existing body of international law addressed only partially and inconclusively. Supporters of the operation argued that the United States had been attacked by Iranian forces, that Mojtaba Kahmeni had been a direct contributor to the decision-making that had produced those attacks, and that the laws of armed conflict provided sufficient legal basis for targeting an individual who was functionally a combatant, regardless of his formal civilian status. Critics argued that the operation set a precedent that, if accepted as legitimate, would fundamentally destabilize the international system by removing the protections that have historically shielded even the families of adversary leaders from direct targeting. This debate, however important in the long run, was a secondary concern for the governments and military commands trying to manage the immediate crisis. What mattered in the hours following the confirmation of Mojtaba Khamenei's death was the question of what Iran would do next, and what the United States and its allies needed to do to manage the escalation risk that the operation had dramatically intensified. The Iranian government had made explicit threats. It had the capability to execute on those threats through multiple vectors simultaneously, and it was operating in a political environment internally in which the pressure on the leadership to demonstrate that the Islamic Republic could and would respond to what had been done was enormous and potentially irresistible. Within the IRGC's own command structure, the killing of Mojtaba Khamenei had produced a reaction that went beyond the institutional fury of an organization that had lost a politically significant patron. It had activated something deeper, a sense of personal violation among commanders who had cultivated relationships with the younger Khamenei over years, who had seen in him the promise of a supreme leader who understood the IRGC's institutional interests and would protect them in ways that a leader emerging from the clerical establishment alone might not. These commanders were not merely angry in the abstract. They were personally motivated, and the IRGC's track record of translating personal motivation into operational action, sometimes in ways that outpaced the formal authorization of the political leadership, was a factor that American intelligence analysts were weighting heavily in their assessments of the near-term threat picture. The network of Iranian proxy forces across the region was simultaneously receiving what sources described as activation signals, communications through the channels that Iran uses to coordinate with Hezbollah, with the Iraqi militia groups, with the Houthis, and with smaller affiliated networks in Syria, Gaza, and elsewhere. The precise content of those communications was not yet fully characterized by American signals intelligence, but the pattern of traffic, its volume, its urgency, its geographic distribution, was consistent with the early stages of coordinating a distributed retaliatory campaign designed to strike American and Israeli interests simultaneously across multiple theaters. The prospect of that kind of multi-front distributed attack against American military bases, against Israeli cities, against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf, against the energy infrastructure of Gulf states aligned with the United States, was the nightmare scenario that American and Allied military planners had been preparing for and now had to treat as a live operational probability rather than a planning contingency. The intelligence community's assessment, delivered to senior American officials in a briefing that took place within hours of the public confirmation of Mojtaba Khamenei's death, was characterized by those who received it as among the most sobering they had ever sat through. The conclusion was not that war was certain, it was that the number of pathways to war had multiplied dramatically in the preceding 72 hours, and that the number of pathways to de-escalation had narrowed to a degree that made the work of the diplomats and back-channel communicators trying to find an exit from the crisis more urgent and more difficult than it had been at any previous point in the confrontation. The men and women responsible for American national security in this moment understood, with a clarity that required no elaboration, that they had entered territory from which there was no clean exit. The operation had been designed to impose a cost severe enough to change Iran's calculus. Whether it would succeed in that goal, or whether it would instead harden Iranian resolve, unify Iranian domestic opinion behind the hardline establishment, and produce a retaliatory campaign that escalated the conflict to levels that would make everything that had come before look like a prelude. That question was not yet answered. It would be answered by decisions not yet made, by actions not yet taken, by human beings on both sides of a conflict that had just entered a phase for which history offered no precise precedent and no reliable guide. The Persian Gulf, the streets of Tel Aviv, the waters where American and Iranian forces had exchanged fire, and now the soil of Iran itself where an operation of extraordinary audacity had just been executed. All of these were nodes in a crisis network that was growing more complex and more dangerous with every passing hour. The thread connecting them all was the question of whether the escalation logic that had driven events from the speculation about Khamenei's health to the missile strike on Tel Aviv to the naval engagement to the SEAL operation could be broken before it reached a conclusion that none of the parties involved actually wanted, but that all of them, through the accumulation of their choices, might nonetheless produce. That is the question on which everything now turns. And the answer, as of this moment, remains terrifyingly open.